It arrived in Australia in the dying days of the First World War. Ultimately, the Spanish flu would infect a third of the world's population and kill at least 50 million people. All those docking in Sydney were isolated at North Head, next door to St Patrick's Seminary. The church had been granted land there on the basis that Catholic seminarians were so thick-skinned they would not take smallpox, and were a useful barrier between the diseased and the healthy in Sydney. Now they're expected to be human shields against the Spanish flu. When the troop ship Medic arrived with 1,000, mostly Australian soldiers aboard, a third of whom had the flu, the Q station was overwhelmed and an appeal went out for extra nurses. Annie Egan was one of 9 children from a devout Catholic family of Gunnedah wheat farmers. Schooled by the Sisters of Mercy, 3 of her sisters entered the convent. But Annie went up to Sydney to pursue nursing at St Vincent's. Her photo is of a dark-eyed young woman smiling warmly in her uniform, a cowlick of dark hair curling under a white veil. Having passed the nursing examination in June 1918, Annie was asked to nurse returning soldiers at the quarantine station. Large numbers were weak and racked with pharyngitis, fever, headache, back pain, and insomnia. Many developed pneumonia, and plum-coloured shadows crept along their bodies. Some lost their hearing, sight, teeth, and hair. Some bled from nose and mouth. Eventually, they drowned in their own fluids. There were no antibiotics, no antivirals, no steroids. Nurse Egan and companions did what they could, bathing fevered bodies, operating inhalation chambers, dispensing painkillers. Despite a mask, she was soon infected. As her condition worsened, she pleaded for confession and extreme unction. The local priest was willing, but the authorities would admit no priest. As she lay dying, she was allowed a brief phone call with the priest, who promised to say Mass for her. She died that afternoon. Another Catholic nurse conducted the obsequies, and Annie was buried on site with full military honours, a bugler playing the last post, and the troops for whom she had given her life firing a salute and laying wreaths of wildflowers. When the story of her being denied the sacraments made the press, the Catholic community were outraged, and many non-Catholics sympathised. Archbishop Michael Kelly announced a requiem mass would be held for her in this cathedral, with her family, nursing friends, clergy, and numerous politicians in attendance. During the Mass, Kelly emphatically protested against the refusal of the authorities to allow a priest to attend the dying Nurse Egan with the holy oils, declaring never was there so impious a refusal. God grant that it be the last. He wired his protest to Prime Minister Billy Hughes, who was in London for the post-war peace talks, and to the acting PM in Canberra. When he got no reply, Kelly took horse and carriage and 2 burly monsignors to the Q station, demanding admission so he could minister to the sick. He was told he'd be arrested if he tried. But sympathetic reporters had been tipped off, and the government soon caved. From now on, Romish priests could bring their oils to the Q station if they must. And to my pride, young priests readily volunteered for training and to be available for that service where it required during the present pandemic. Of course, Christians had seen this sort of thing before. In the plagues of the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Christian era, when others fled the Christian stage to feed, nurse and care pastorally for the sick. The death rates in their towns were half those in the rest of the Roman Empire, and this inspired many conversions. So too in the Justinian plague of the 6th century and beyond, the Black Death of the 14th and after, Christian populations were decimated and monasteries and polities destroyed. But Christians shone in providing care. Miraculous images were carried through the streets, suffrages offered for the living and the dead, hospitals built and staffed, and those sacraments craved by Annie Egan, offered by the church's pastors. In every pandemic, from the earliest to the present, Christians have arrived with their emollients. Oil was, of course, essential for cooking and lighting in the ancient world. Anointing was a sign of welcome and respect. In ancient sport, oil was used to massage and strengthen. In ancient hygiene, to purge and cleanse. In ancient medicine, to cure and comfort. Oil features in the Old Testament as a sign of divine blessing in agriculture and a product of human manufacture, trade and wealth. It was used as fuel for lamps in preparing food such as the Passover bread, as a healing balm and cosmetic unguent. Oil was offered in the cult, used for ritual cleansing and for dedicating tabernacle and altar, and for anointing priests, prophets and kings, thereafter known as the Lord's anointed. In the New Testament, Jesus is the anointed one, the Christ, as we heard in our gospel today, and is repeatedly seen in an olive grove outside Jerusalem. Oil is a fuel in his parable of the wise and foolish virgins, and a measure of debt in his story of the dishonest steward. It's an ingredient in the bread for the Eucharist and used for anointing self, guests, the sick, and the dead. Oil also has metaphorical uses in our scriptures, as in speech smoother than oil, being anointed with the Spirit, and the oil of gladness. The oils we consecrate today are heirs to this rich symbolism. They are signs of divine blessing, enrichment, enlightenment, of respect, welcome and nourishment, of worship, consecration, ordination, of cleansing, comforting and healing. Above all, they symbolise Christification, being made like Christ, the Anointed One. And today's Gospel makes clear that we are anointed not just as, but for bringing good news to sad hearts, for liberating people from constraints, for offering sight and insight, for proclaiming the Lord's favour. Our Christian life begins with baptism, when the oil of catechumens calls babies and adults into the communion of saints on earth. It ends with extreme unction, when the oil of the sick comforts and heals, then eases those at the last into the communion of saints in heaven. Both are oils of gladness. For it is with easy joy that priests join people to God at their beginning, and with a harder but profounder joy that we consign them to Him at the end. So two glad unctions frame the whole Christian life and the particular mission of the priest. But our gladdest oil of all is the sacred chrism. With this we dedicate churches and altars, setting them aside for God's use as sacred places and for sacred purposes. With this oil we dedicate human souls also, crowning them after baptism and sealing them in confirmation, setting them aside for God's use as living temples. With this oil too we dedicate priests, setting them aside for God's use as conduits between the human and divine. The one oil of gladness that ordered Jesus to bring good news to the poor ordains priests too to bring gospel freedom and divine joy to human hearts. As Christ was anointed with perfumed oil before he went to the cross, so each priest is chrismed as another Christ, to bring the fragrance of hope to such as those who've experienced isolation and desolation in the recent pandemic. My brothers, as I said when I ordained our 4 newest members last month, God now wants a spiritual pandemic, and we must be its vectors. We must bring about an epidemic of hope and courage, love and mercy, beauty and goodness, faith and reason for our times. Recommit yourselves then to bringing the oil of gladness to a world as much in need of such care as it was during the last pandemic and all those before it. During that last pandemic, when thick-skinned seminarians blockaded the dying and a thick-set archbishop insisted on the rights of religion. I now invite the priests present or watching by live streaming to stand to renew their priestly promises.